Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richmond, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle. The show, as many of you know, brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issue of the day. And of course, the burning issue today is still Ukraine. So Sheldon, I thought we'd talk a little bit about current events and talk about what's going on over there from a libertarian perspective. That is the perspective that you're not going to get in the mainstream media. The vote, not surprisingly, has gone in favor of Crimea joining the Russians, and not surprising, you have Obama imposing sanctions on Russian officials. But one thing that befuddles me about these sanctions, Sheldon, and maybe you can answer the question, is that it seems to me that Vladimir Putin is the driving force behind all this. If he weren't pushing this to happen, it wouldn't have happened. The troops would not have invaded Crimea all on their own, or the defense minister would never have ordered them to invade. So Putin's the guy responsible for all this, and yet the sanctions, from what I can tell, and I haven't studied the list carefully, but they're all based on subordinates of Putin. Maybe some of the big oligarchs there. I'm not sure about that, but at least some of the subordinates. Now that makes no sense to me. Why would they not put sanctions on Putin himself? Why do they exempt him from the sanctions when they themselves are saying that he's responsible for it?
Well, I don't know what sanctions on Putin himself would mean. I don't know that he owns any companies, so I don't know how you'd put sanctions on him except to say, what, you can't travel anywhere, you can't come to Europe.
Well, they could freeze his bank accounts.
Well, assuming he's got money outside of Russia, of course he might, but yeah, I don't know. I guess, of course the idea is he's the head of a state, and therefore they feel justified in going against any interest that they think is linked to the Russian state. And of course there's the further reasoning I guess they would engage in, where they'd say if we hit these oligarchs and these companies, then they'll put pressure on Putin to reverse course because they're hurting. The interesting thing is that these things won't hurt the U.S. very much. They'll hurt Europe. There's a lot of trade between Europe and Russia, so it's really easy for America to call for sanctions because Americans aren't going to suffer too much. Now, they may face higher prices in natural gas eventually if Europe decides to not buy Russian natural gas anymore, and that's the main source for them. And the U.S. decides to, fill out the supply to make up for that loss of supply, however they do it, increased production or whatever. That may cause the price of natural gas to rise for Americans too. So we would find ourselves being hit as a result of this in our monthly utility bill. But the thing is, Europe's going to get hurt by this, which is why Europe doesn't seem very enthusiastic about the sanctions anyway. There's a lot of economic exchange between Russia and Europe, and you can't hurt one without hurting the other. So it's going to be interesting to see how this comes out.
Well, and you know darn well that Russia is going to retaliate in some way. We don't know what that way is. I mean, Putin's over there mobilizing troops on the eastern border of Ukraine. I don't eliminate the possibility that he could invade there with the pretense of protecting Russian citizens. And but there's also just no telling what he could do with respect to his retaliatory measures, stopping the flow of gas into Ukraine. From what I understand, they owe Russia over $1 billion, and you could say, hey, I want my money in advance. It's going to get nasty if they think that Russia's going to just bow down and Putin's going to get down on his knees and say, please forgive me, please remove the sanctions. They don't know the long history of Russia. There's too much pride here. They perceive themselves as an independent nation rather than a subordinate of the U.S. empire. And the idea that sanctions is going to somehow or another buckle Putin to his knees is as ludicrous as the sanctions or the embargo was against Cuba. The attitude is the same. We're an independent country, and we won't cotton to this. I think it's also important to reemphasize, Sheldon, the role that NATO has played in all this. I just blogged today about what would happen if the shoe were on the other foot. Suppose NATO had disbanded, which it should have disbanded at the end of the Cold War, but the Warsaw Pact did not disband. And that Putin was rounding up his members, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Cuba, and then it instigated protests in Mexico against the U.S. drug war, which succeeded in ousting the democratically elected president, installing a pro-Moscow regime in Mexico, plans to put anti-missile defense systems into Cuba. We all know what the response of the U.S. would be to this. I mean, they would be calling the Russians deceivers and double-crossers and getting ready to, accusing the Russians of getting ready to attack the United States. We'd see the CIA and the Pentagon pressuring Obama to attack Mexico to oust this illegitimate regime, probably invade Cuba to remove the anti-missile missile system there. I mean, it's easy for us to look at it in those kind of terms and see it. But what U.S. officials and what Americans can't see is why Russia would react the exact same way when NATO's done that precise thing. They've absorbed these Eastern European countries. They've proposed anti-missile defense systems close to Russia's borders. They plan to absorb Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, placing NATO, including Germany, because Germany is a member of NATO, right on Russia's borders. And which would, of course, would mean that the Russian bases in Crimea would have been under NATO jurisdiction. Why can't Americans see this? And what we really need to be talking about here is the vital importance of disbanding NATO, in fact, disbanding the whole national security state apparatus.
Yeah, looking at it from the other side, of course, is a very helpful way to shed light on this, which is something Americans never do. The U.S. is condemning the vote yesterday in Crimea as illegal and unconstitutional, but the change in regime in Kiev it looks illegal and unconstitutional. It's been described even by some mainstream types as extra-constitutional. So that government is not a legal government that's there now. So how can it be condemning a vote in Crimea as unconstitutional and illegal? There's hypocrisy all over the place. And the U.S., was meddling along with Europe in Ukraine before all this happened, pushing a very hard deal. The EU is pushing a very hard deal on Ukraine. While Putin, on the other hand, was, as I read things, was actually pushing a more reasonable deal, saying you don't have to be exclusively with us or the EU. But the EU is saying, yes, you do, and putting some pretty harsh terms attached to the agreement, which, as Scott Horton pointed out, seemed calculated to make the Ukrainian president at that time, Yanukovych, turn it down, which then precipitated this crisis. Which makes me wonder whether the UN, and let's remember, we have this tape that was leaked of the U.S. Secretary of State Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, talking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine before all this happened, talking about who the next leader should be, who the next prime minister should be. This guy, Yatsenyuk, who now is the prime minister. He was like our guy. Yats. Yats is the man, she says. That's his nickname, Yats. He's the former central banker. He was amenable to the U.S. government and presumably the IMF and the World Bank and the Europeans. She was just mad that the Europeans were being so slow to push things along. And she happens to be, she's a neocon. She happens to be the wife of Robert Kagan, who's one of the top brain trusters of the neoconservative movement, who, by the way, has written a book called Dangerous Nation, which I've been reading, which talks about the history of American empire. I mean, he's not one who denies there's an American empire. He's one of those people who says, when are you Americans going to wake up to the fact that you are an empire and you've always been an empire and start behaving like one? So there's no argument about whether the U.S. is an empire. They know it. And so this midwifing, the change in regime, that's the term, that was Victoria Nuland's term. We're going to midwife, we can midwife this change. That was an unconstitutional regime change as far as I can tell. And the Russians, paranoid that they're being encircled, and it's not just paranoid because there was good reason to assume they were being encircled, then reacted. That doesn't make what Putin's doing right, or whether I'm not saying it was a fair election. Apparently, there was only one choice, right? You could affiliate with Russia or or nothing. Independence was not a choice. Now, maybe most of the people would have been for affiliating anyway, even if independence was a choice. But there's no way the U.S. can claim that this is just purely Putin acting like he wants to conquer the world or reconstitute the Soviet Union. That's just ridiculous.
Well, and I think we should point out the role that the U.S. support of these so-called NGOs plays in these countries. I mean, this is just another way for the CIA, the Pentagon, to be interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. They funnel money, taxpayer money, U.S. taxpayer money, to these groups under the guise of, oh, we're just promoting democracy. We're advancing democracy. Well, that's not what they're doing. They're over there advancing their agenda. They're trying to get their man or their woman in public office as the president in order to subordinate himself to the wishes of the U.S. empire. That's what all of this money into NGOs is all about in all these countries. This is the way that they get their person in office. And it's that meddling in the domestic affairs of other countries that is so annoying to people within those countries. And you could see Russia looking at this thing saying, well, this is just, a sophisticated way that the CIA is over there trying to oust a guy that was apparently pro-Moscow. So this kind of gamesmanship takes place is so destructive to the best interest of the American people. If you compare it like to Switzerland, you don't see them engaging in these antics. And then you don't see them pacing the floors and so forth over, Russia's absorption of Crimea. They just mind their own business, and they're strictly limited to defense. Now, I wanted to bring up a point that you brought up last week in a piece you did here at FFF about the Ukrainian people themselves. Notice that whenever the U.S. Government goes in and invades and bombs and interferes with these countries, it's always saying, oh, we're doing it for the people there. We love the people. We love the Ukrainians. We love the Iraqis. We love the Afghans. But whenever you suggest, well, how about opening up America's borders to people that would like to come to the United States, like from Ukraine? It's like, oh, no. Wait a minute. Well, we love these people, but we don't love them that much. We'll bomb them, and we'll interfere with their domestic processes, and we'll create chaos within their countries, but don't even think about letting them come over here and visit or stay with us, buy homes here, open businesses here. And that, of course, raises the issue of open immigration. And I think it's kind of interesting that you wrote that piece last week, because I think yesterday was Open Borders Day. The concept of open borders between nations that permit people not only free trade, like that doesn't exist between the United States and Cuba, but also the free movements of people. And that really is the heritage of America, Sheldon, right? Having America be a sanctuary at the same time as not having our government go abroad in search of monsters to destroy.
Well, right. For a lot of the early years of the country, it was pretty easy to get here. They needed people, they wanted people, so they welcomed them with open arms. It's the same argument today. I mean, people coming here, it's only good for them, and we know it's good for them because they're choosing to do it, and they're coming often from wretched situations. But it's also good for us, and that's actually good for the whole world. As Brian Kaplan likes to point out, drawing on some really solid work by economists, the amount of wealth being produced in the world would skyrocket if people were free to move to the U.S. from these very capital poor areas where they live. They'd just be more productive because they'd be surrounded by more machines and technology and computers and all that other stuff. So not only would they personally get wealthier, the world would get wealthier just because output would increase. So if you just want to think of it strictly in economic terms, although that's not strictly economic terms because their lives would be better, it's all good. And the downside is, if you can find any at all, is trivial. So we're for open borders for anybody, not just for Ukrainians. I used the Ukrainian crisis as an excuse to talk about it, but I also pointed out that, hey, Ukrainians aren't special. If they have a right to come here, then anybody has a right to come here, and so it's open borders, not just open borders for Ukrainians.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to emphasize how different libertarians are from these statists, both conservatives and progressives. That, we stand for limited government with respect to foreign affairs. We want to rein in the government. We want to dismantle the foreign empire. We don't want the Pentagon to be serving as the official emissary of the United States with its warships and so forth. We want to dismantle the national security state. It was brought into existence during the Cold War. The Cold War is over. We want to dismantle these dinosaurs, NATO, the CIA, the NSA. We don't want to reform them. And at the same time, we want to liberate the American people to interact with the people of the world. And that was the original founding vision of America, that you have a very limited government, strictly limited to, protecting America from in the unlikely event of an invasion, of an attack. And but you have open borders where people are free to travel and trade, and then people are free to come here to travel and trade and open businesses, live, tour, whatever. I mean, that to me is the key to peace. I mean, this is what Bastiat was saying, that open borders is a key to peace, and it's the key to prosperity. As you point out, it's the key to harmony. We have it exactly opposite under the statists, both conservatives and progressives. They want unrestrained government overseas, and they want to isolate the American people with immigration controls and trade restrictions and embargoes and sanctions and tariffs. And, of course, this sanctions business against Russia is just a continuation of that.
Yeah, I see more of a continuum with earlier American history in this regard, and I think a lot of it was security related. In other words, in the minds of the people calling the shots, they saw it as a matter of security. And early on, they wanted to spread the American country, the U.S., the new U.S., westward across the full continent, which, of course, and there were people in the way, so they had to be moved out of the way. And north, they had designs on Canada, and south, they had designs on Mexico. And further south, they had designs on South America. You can see it in their statements. And they often expressed it in terms of security. They felt America was exceptional, and therefore it was alone, and therefore it was always at risk because it was surrounded by the non-exceptional. And therefore it needed to spread and help create republics that would either be formally part of the U.S. or linked still to what they called the mother country, namely the United States. And that was not only supposedly for the good of the unenlightened, because we were bringing enlightenment to the new world, but it was also for the security, our security. That's how they described it. They might not have used the word national security, but they used the word security and safety and tranquility. And even the War of 1812, part of the, according to Gordon Wood, part of the motive of the War of 1812 against England was regime change in England. They thought we'd never be safe as long as there was a monarchy in England. That in England needed a republic, and then we would be safe. So I see much more continuity. I think it's the same kind of thinking. It's gotten more sophisticated. The technology is a lot better, and so I think we're fighting a very old battle.
Well, you got a good point, but I take issue with it in this sense that I think that the common vision was to stay out of European wars. I mean, that was John Quincy Adams' big point when he addressed Congress, and I think it was 1824. America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy it. This was George Washington's farewell message of stay out of entangling alliances over there. That Europe's been filled with wars. I mean, these disputes like the Crimea dispute, the ancient disputes between Germany and other countries, I mean, they go back centuries. And some of them are now starting to surface. And I think the original idea, despite manifest destiny and so forth, is stay out of European wars, stay out of Asian wars, leave them alone, let them fight their wars, and establish a model society of freedom here. So that's the big difference I see. I mean, that's why I look at the Spanish-American War as a really turning point, where now the U.S. says, no, we've got to become an overseas empire. We've got to start, going abroad and acquiring possessions, just like the British Empire and later the Soviet Empire and so forth. So I draw a distinction there.
Yeah, but in the 1780s and even 70s, they were talking about outreaches to China and Hawaii. Even back then, Cuba was always in their sights, and and it's true that Quincy Adams' speech is an eloquent speech, but unfortunately it doesn't go beyond, and he may well have believed it. I think part of the problem was even the ones that were anti-empire, even the American leaders that were anti-empire, still wanted ends that required empire. And they didn't quite maybe grasp that. So they ended up in the empire camp anyway. So under James Monroe, and Quincy Adams was his Secretary of State when that speech was made, they aided Greek revolutionaries. Monroe aided Greek revolutionaries. That was after the promulgation of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine said, Europe, we'll stay out of Europe. They didn't quite stick to that. But Europe, you stay out of the hemisphere. And they meant the entire hemisphere. We could meddle because we're good. We're going to do it on behalf of republicanism, and we don't want you monarchies meddling here. So I think there's a sort of an opportunistic side to it. They made some nice speeches. They occasionally did some good things. But Jefferson is Gordon Wood calls him the most expansionist-minded president that the U.S. has ever had. I mean, the Louisiana Purchase was 825,000 square miles. It was the heartland of the continent.
Well, I think it's like
and he knew it was unconstitutional. He knew it.
Well, I think it's like so many of these other issues that developed through the 1800s is that you have a strand of libertarianism battling against a strand of statism. And so, we certainly couldn't suggest that everyone in America was a libertarian. But what's amazing to me is how libertarian thought prevailed in many instances. In fact, I thought we'd move to a third area where this is kind of an interesting point relating to what we're talking about, and that's monetary issues. I mean, as you know, that throughout history, governments have debased and plundered people, even before paper money, before Gutenberg invented the printing press. You had debasement of gold coins, what they call it, clipping the coin. And then the printing press comes into existence, and regimes realize how they can plunder and loot people just by printing money, just spending money that they've just newly printed from the printing press. What a great way to loot people. You debase the currency, and people they don't have any idea what's happening. They blame the private sector for raising prices. They don't realize the government's doing this. And yet here, so you have this whole body of statists that love this type of system, but then the Constitution comes into existence and we establish a monetary sphere that wasn't perfect from a libertarian standpoint, but you got gold coins circulating as money, silver coins. This is the official money of the United States. This is what was called the gold standard. And yet, as we know, there was paper money circulating among private banks because the states were prohibited from issuing bills of credit or paper money on the by the Constitution. But by and large, over 100 years, you have a fairly sound monetary system in which the government, the federal government, is precluded from plundering and looting people. And I think this is an interesting thing to go into with respect to what the Bitcoin controversy is all about. I mean, here you have this alternative currency developed in the private sector. I wonder how long the government's going to permit it to go on. I mean, the government hates competition in the monetary sphere. I think maybe they're concerned about being perceived as looking like China, copying China, which of course is I think shut down the Bitcoin industry to a large extent in China. But we have the same kind of issue taking place in American history, the monetary status versus the free market advocates that want sound money. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm watching the Bitcoin thing very closely. It's very interesting. I don't know if the government can actually shut it down. It's as I understand it, highly decentralized. The other interesting thing about Bitcoin is it's not a commodity money, right? You can't cash it in for, you could sell your Bitcoins, but it's not backed by gold or backed by some precious metal or some basket of commodities. So in that way, it sort of runs counter to the Mengerian, Misesian idea of money, that money begins as something that's useful in its own right and then emerges as a highly tradable thing and then becomes money. So that's going to be real interesting to see how that goes. I mean, I don't claim to understand it. Is it just ideology that's buying it, that's behind it? I mean, why do people accept it? Well, you accept it because you expect other people to accept it. Well, why do they accept it? So I'm trying to watch it closely. Some of it's rather technical as well, but I'm keeping my eye on it. So it sounds like more like paper, except I realize there's a cap. What is it, like 21 million bitcoins or something, and no more after that. So unlike paper, which can be infinitely produced, there's a difference there. But speaking of paper, in 1819, I think it was, Alexander Baring of the famous financial family in England testified before the Parliament that America's economy was more awash and more based on paper money than any economy in the world. 1819. Like you say, the state chartered banks were issuing paper money beyond the amount of specie they had. The people loved it. They demanded it. They were using it. And here's the interesting thing. The Bank of the United States, which libertarians tend to dislike, it was a private bank. It wasn't a central bank like the Fed. It was a private bank where the government put all its deposits. It could not issue money. But what it did do was buy up state money, state currencies from the state banks, in order to bring the outstanding amount of money closer to what their specie was. In other words, it was an anti-inflationary device. What constituted a central bank in those days was actually anti-inflationary. So there's all kinds of twists and turns in the history of money and banking in the United States.
Well, yeah, but at least they abolished the national bank, and yeah, I see it as just a way to facilitate government transactions, a collection of taxes, and so forth. But they got rid of it, and another difference there was that everybody understood that these banknotes that were being issued by the private banks were notes. They were promissory notes. Everybody understood the real money was gold and silver, and that these were notes promising to pay. Now, they may have been demand instruments, but nonetheless, everybody understood this is not money. It's promising to pay money. It's facilitating transactions. You look at it today after they've sort of smashed this whole memory out of existence among the American people. People look at a Federal Reserve note. They don't even stop to think, why is it saying note on it? Well, note, what does that mean? Promise to pay what? I mean, if you go into a bank and say, okay, I'm here to collect, they give you another note. It's an irredeemable, what we call fiat money. And what they really ended up doing was destroying what was really the finest monetary system in history. I mean, there was a reason why railroads were issuing 100-year bonds. And because people understood that, hey, 100 years, I'm going to get paid back in gold, the same value as gold is when the bond is originally issued. So the government could not debase these long-term instruments out of existence. So there was financial stability along with no income tax, open immigration, and so forth. I mean, that was the foundation for the great degree of prosperity, the soaring of prosperity throughout the 19th century. Now, as libertarians, we wouldn't favor a government-established gold standard or silver standard. We want a free market of money. I mean, this is Hayek's message, and this Bitcoin thing is sort of a reflection on that. But, if people are free to use Bitcoin, then what does that do for legal tender laws, Sheldon? I mean, why can't people be free to transact in any currency in this country? Why do they have to be limited to Federal Reserve notes? Why not, as Hayek says, have a denationalization of money? And even if the government does operate its paper money system, let it compete against others. Let it collect its taxes in dollars, but let everybody else transact in the money that they want, whether it's gold, silver, bitcoins, or any other kind of medium of exchange.
Well, I don't think it's today illegal to transact in with other things. I mean, barter is perfectly legal. As long as the government taxes and says it wants dollars, that already gives a huge nudge to the government's currency, because you need to procure dollars in order to pay your taxes. That's an old trick. That's what the imperialist powers did in Africa. They would in order to get people to work in the mines, they said you had to pay your taxes in whatever the home country's money was, and the only way you get that money was to work in the mines. So it was a rigged system. So taxation, I think, rigs the whole system. I think you and I today could make a contract where you'll pay me in anything I agree to take. The problem is I need dollars to pay taxes, and if I don't pay the taxes, then you know what happens to me. Yeah,
that's an interesting question. And if you and I make a contract, I lend you money, and you promised to pay me back in bitcoins in terms of a certain, well, just say bitcoins, and then you come and offer me Federal Reserve notes in payment of the debt. It's interesting to see what the courts would do in that kind of instance. And of course, lurking in the background always is the power of the government in a crisis to cancel all those contracts, as Roosevelt did. He canceled all the gold clauses. I mean, that was the whole idea behind gold clauses in railroad bonds and other debt instruments. And they just unilaterally suspended it, canceled these contractual provisions. Whether they can do so again, I don't see why not. I mean, that case has never been overruled. But your issue, the question you raise, is a very interesting one, is can people contract in whatever medium of exchange they want, and then can the creditor reject Federal Reserve notes that are offered in liquidation of that debt? That's an interesting question.
I don't know the case law. I would be interested to hear how things stand.
On that note,
taxation. I was going to say taxation is the big thumb on the scale.
Well, absolutely, because if government can demand that its taxes be paid in dollars, then everybody has to acquire the dollars. But at least people in that instance can protect themselves, and especially long-term debt instruments, from the debasement of the currency as the government's flooding the money supply with it. On that note, if you'll excuse the pun, we'll wrap things up. We're about out of time. This is the Libertarian Angle. It's been a pleasure being with you. This is Jacob Hornberger with Sheldon Richmond. And if you'd like to know more about the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. You got any questions or comments about the show today, write us at fff.org. We'd love to hear from you. And that's the show. And until next time, we'll see you then.